Hello, everyone. I apologize for my delay in actually uploading this. When I actually recorded my first version of this, I realized I actually recorded off of a previous or a first draft, if you will. So I got about halfway through and realized that I had actually had no pictures. My name is Kevin Pierce. I'm a graduate student here at Florida State University, and today we're going to be talking about Hurricane Camille, the monster storm of the Gulf Coast by Philip Aaron. So there's three kind of main topics that I really want each one of us to explore as we're going through my narration. The first is the individual perspective that each survivor, if you will, had to endure. This is one thing that the author does an incredible job on. I'm not going to go through and list the massive amount of characters in his book because there are so many, but the author really does an incredible job as far as putting you in the actual survivors, I guess kind of like their state, if you will, at multiple times. The second part is the hurricane itself. Camille was an absolute just monster storm, and I really hope that through this presentation that everyone will be able to understand the complexity and the severity of this storm. And third, because we are in a policy-driven class, I couldn't leave our presentation without really kind of putting in a lot of policies. Then, in my opinion, that ended up coming back to fruition later in life. So the book overview itself, and again, I'm not going to do a very, very deep dive in this. Again, it's written in kind of bibliography context. Like I mentioned before, the author does this incredible job of connecting with the individuals that were really impacted by this storm. The local residents, to include merchants, farmers, fishermen, college students, you name it. He really dives deep and interviews and talks with pretty much everyone within this community, as well as those local the local law enforcement officers, the emergency medical personnel, really your first responders who actually lived through this. Not only did these individuals have a duty to help those in need, but these are also individuals that are leaving their homes that are in the same status as those that they're trying to help. So he did a really great job on that. Another perspective was the governmental side as far as responding units, talking about those civil defense forces, which of course is the predecessor to emergency management, as well as the military personnel, specifically looking at the National Guardsmen that were deployed. And then the last part was kind of like the author, while he did a really great job as far as talking to individuals, he did have to get a lot of secondhand accounts actually from the Mississippi Oral History Program at the University of Southern Mississippi. So if you get a chance to read this, there's a lot of first-person narrative or narration, but there are some things that he has to go through and, again, just pull from secondary sources. So again, being in this type of class, I wanted to focus on the policy side of the book, and these were kind of four areas that I found as I was reading that really stuck out to me. Coastal development and disaster planning was definitely one of them. This area, it has a history, obviously, with disasters, and you really start seeing, where this kind of came from. The relief and recovery efforts. Now, the incorrect information or failure to listen. Now, that's kind of a really unique thing. So if you go through this and you get a chance to read it, I hope you, and we'll kind of talk about later on some of the quotes that I pulled, but I hope you kind of have that, which side you're going to be on or not. And lastly, the psychological impacts of surviving this storm that do play out later on. So just to kind of put things in a historical context as far as this storm, Camille, again, it was just this massive storm. Now, this is from an open source site, and I really, when I found these, it really it stuck out to me because I was actually involved in Hurricane Katrina. I remember that storm. I was in the military at the time and actually responded to it. So it was kind of easy for me to kind of put that into place and to see that Camille was actually a more intense storm than Katrina. And as well as we also can look at some other storms that maybe individuals have been around again, maybe Wilma or Opal back in '95. And so, and then if you look on, as far as the other slide or on the other picture, as far as like landfall tropical cyclones, this storm had higher strengths than Andrew. It had higher strengths than Michael, than Maria. So it's pretty easy for us to, kind of contextualize that and say, well, I was here and, during Hurricane Michael and I was, in this area. So I kind of understand. So you really know what kind of like that 155 feels like, and to know that, individuals had to go through, 175 mile an hour winds. I just really hope this is able to kind of give a nice little comparison. So Hurricane Camille itself, again, I'm not going to insult anyone's intelligence by reading verbatim, but what really struck me was that this is one of only 3 true Cat 5s to make landfall. We don't really see that a whole lot, and when I found that information on the National Hurricane Center, it was just that really stuck out to me. And of course, here's an overhead image of the actual storm itself. And if any of us can remember, basically the past 15 years, that's a very eerie picture, because when you're looking at Michael not too long ago, and then Katrina, it reminded me a lot of Hurricane Katrina as far as where it sits in the Gulf and where the eye is. So when, from the book itself, plus some other open source, this is where we're kind of start getting into like more of the actual weeds, if you will. Within the book itself, a lot of individuals, they refuse to leave the shoreline. Because they didn't really believe that it was as strong as the civil defense forces were saying. And then the individuals that lived further out, they believed that because they were, roughly 20 feet above sea level, that the storm wouldn't really affect them. That storm surge wouldn't be that high. That the government is just overinflating, or they're just trying to scare people. One of the quotes from the book. This is the first one, obviously, and I thought it was really interesting. It's you talk your grandma into going, and we'll go. That kind of that really stood out, saying, you have to convince your grandmother to leave. And if she says that we'll go, then we'll actually go. Then we, should be concerned. That really kind of resonated with me. Maybe just because within today that we're a little more accustomed, but you had to convince I guess maybe she was the matriarchal of the family or something along that lines. One thing that I like, I guess I'm kind of a numbers person. To put things into context, the storm surge was estimated to be around 24 feet. And I've actually got some pictures later on that will help illustrate that. Sustained winds at 155, gusting at 175, and those are just those numbers. They're terrifying. To think that individuals lived through this. Total lives lost was 259, and the damage at the time was $1.43 billion. To put that in perspective, again, that would be $9.8 billion in today's market. So I hope this slide, or the past 2 slides, if you will, kind of helps set everything up into what we're going into next, as far as kind of like breaking the book down a little bit. So within the chapter review itself, and this is kind of like how I grouped everything together, the chapter 1 was a lot about kind of life prior to. It was a lot about just daily life in Mississippi. Individuals going to work, fishermen going out. Now, the really unique thing is they were within the Civil Defense Force. They were actually talking about how to, if there was to be an evacuation order at some point in time, how would they actually disseminate that information? Nowadays, of course, we have cell phones and internet and everything else. But it was really unique because what they were saying was that the best time to alert the community was actually Sunday morning. Traditionally, because everyone has gone to church and they've come home from church, and that would actually be the best time because there's only at this time in 1969 there's only roughly three ways or actually four ways, I apologize, individuals could be contacted. Uh, you know, Telephone, radio, TV, and then of course just the classic person running down the street yelling. I thought that was pretty impactful. That was not that long ago, but just that difference in communication. Chapters 2 and 3 were kind of unique. I'm assuming this was kind of the author's way of kind of breaking away a little bit. 2 and 3 really talk about the history of hurricanes in the Gulf and actually the history of the Gulf of Mexico. I will kind of get into my critique on that one later. But yeah, chapters 2 and 3 I thought were they probably could be combined into one in my opinion. I didn't really need 2 chapters talking about the history of hurricanes, especially in the Gulf of Mexico. Chapters 4 and 6. So just to kind of put things in context, chapters 4 and 6, the titles are Killer Camille, Tracking the Storm, and the Survivors. So what I did was I pulled unique quotes out of each one of them that kind of really helped, again, emphasize that part of the book. The Get Out one. As they were basically driving around, this was the Saturday prior to the storm hit. The storm hit on a Sunday. This is the Saturday prior to, and they're driving around in a National Guard vehicle, just yelling over a loudspeaker for individuals to get out of the area, to get out of basically the impact area. Going into chapter 5, this to me it really stood out. It looks like a war zone. And that really kind of stood out. That particular phrase really stood out to me. And again, I've got some pictures later on that'll help illustrate that. And when it comes to the misinformation, and again, this will come later on, but there was actually people were at the college were actually running around talking about a hurricane party. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that name, just the Manor Apartments. But they didn't really think the storm was that severe or that deadly. So, we here in Florida, we joke all the time about let's have a hurricane party, category 1, who cares? But, this is something that, these individuals, they kind of have that same mentality. The difference is that they didn't really know the severity of the storm, or the government really wasn't telling them. So it really was unclear. And then chapter 7 was 100% a warning as far as the community. When they rebuilt rather fast because of the gaming industry. A lot of the codes necessarily weren't updated. So when we start talking that mitigation side, it just pretty much flows right into that. And unfortunately, it set a lot of things up for Hurricane Katrina. Katrina wasn't just New Orleans, but Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, which is also where Camille pretty much went through. A lot of the houses, unfortunately, because when they were rebuilt post Camille, were not built to a very high standard, and that unfortunately came to play later on. So here are the 4 images that I talked about. So moving upper left and then to the lower, that's a shrimping boat that's been picked up and put on her keel in someone's yard. That just kind of shows the power of the storm itself. We were talking about those flood lines. Those are probably single family homes, and that's 20 plus feet. That means if individuals were able to hide, they were hiding in the attic. A lot of within the survivors aspect, they talk about that, as the floodwaters would come in, they would start to move into the attic. And there are a couple stories where they actually have to break through the roof and then push people out small windows because the floodwaters are rising. On the bottom left, obviously it's a National Guard unit. Now, this is obviously right on the coast, and what really took me about this picture was again that phrase of, it's either gone or destroyed. There's nothing light there. Those are all cinder blocks. Looks like a sink. But there's no light debris. Again, it's around the shoreline. So what that's kind of showing is that the only thing that was left in that area was obviously pretty heavy debris. And on the bottom right side, that's an apartment building. The previous picture of that was I believe it was a 2 or 3 story apartment building, and you can see what it looks like now. And again, that's just kind of that's that kind of mentality where, oh, we don't need to leave, let's have a party type deal. That was pretty rampant actually in that chapter. So here's my analysis portion of the actual book itself. I can't stress enough. It's an absolutely incredibly well written book. There's so many firsthand accounts, and what the author does is that he moves and manipulates. I guess manipulates not the best word, but he moves around to where, as you're listening to these stories, you're building a map in your head of the impact of the storm. You're seeing it from a multiple perspective, so you can kind of gauge how this storm actually looks. And again, there's my critique of chapter 2 and chapter 3. I'm not a big fan, I guess, of romanticizing hurricanes. And, I was reading this book. I was interested about Hurricane Camille, not about the first inhabitants of the Gulf Coast states, at 1500 BCE. So that's kind of my individual critique, if you will. Maybe that helps some readers out. It just wasn't for me. So when it comes to the policies, the failures and successes, on the failure side, I guess, if you will, we can, again, hindsight's being always 20/20. While the National Guard, the Civil Defense Forces were going out there, were warning individuals, there was really it was insignificant. There was no way that people could really, I guess, quantify it, if you will. There's within the chapters, they're saying how they drove around, they would knock on doors and talk to people and individuals, and they just almost weren't trusting the government to sit there and say, well, you tell me it's bad, but it's not really that bad. And of course, there's a line with the rise of gambling. Again, just building codes they weren't inflated that much, unfortunately. They maybe did a little bit, but there was not a lot. One thing that I did really like about it is the preparation side. Luckily, as the storm was going in and around Cuba, the U.S. government was able to kind of see this, and they were able to see that it was going to be a bad storm. So 24 hours actually prior to the storm making landfall, the National Guard and Civil Defense Forces were actually activated there on scene to basically help ride the storm out. Again, they were warning individuals. And the last thing that we'll talk about is actually what we currently have today as far as the Cat 1, 2, Cat 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. This scale was actually created in the wake of Hurricane Camille so that individuals would understand the severity of the storm. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you all so much. I hope that you've learned a little bit about this book, kind of, again, my kind of overview of it. And if you have the time, I highly suggest reading it. It's a really wonderfully written book about the individual perspective that either went through this or responded. And in my opinion, it definitely articulates on the planning and policy side warnings that unfortunately did come about later on, especially in Hurricane Katrina. Again, my name is Kevin Pierce. Thank you so much for your time.